shooters, shoot-em-ups, STGs, shooting games, shmups. People have many names for the 2D shooting game genre that gained massive popularity in the late 1970s and evolved greatly throughout the 80s. One series in particular, however, was incredibly instrumental in this evolution: Gradius. Its forward-thinking ideas, gorgeous graphics, intriguing environments, and interesting ship and enemy designs bolstered just what the genre could be and helped shape what it would become. Gradius's importance to the video game industry and its effect on many of its pioneers cannot be denied. This is its long and complex history. Our story begins in 1981, 4 years before anyone would ever hear of the name Gradius, with the release of Konami's arcade title, Scramble. Scramble was a 2D scrolling shoot-em-up that saw its players controlling a spaceship that could fire horizontally while also dropping bombs on ground-based enemies and fuel storage containers. Colliding with the environment or any of the multiple enemies or projectiles on screen would instantly destroy the ship and lose a life. While making your way through Scramble's levels, the player also has a timer slowly ticking down, which is represented by the ship's fuel gauge. Running out of fuel is an instant loss of a life, but more can be collected by destroying the many fuel containers throughout the ship's levels. Nowadays, this premise sounds pretty simple and straightforward, but in 1981, this was a groundbreaking arcade game and would become incredibly successful for Konami. They would quickly try to capitalize on its success by releasing a spiritual sequel for the title that same year, named Super Cobra. Instead of a spaceship though, players would now control a helicopter. While Super Cobra was technically a sequel to Scramble, it shared nearly identical gameplay and was obviously a quick and cheap way for Konami to keep the quarters rolling in at the arcades. 3 years would pass with no mention of a true sequel to the game until 1984, when development began on a new title codenamed Scramble 2. Konami would put together a new arcade development team in 1984 consisting of 5 members, 2 programmers and 3 designers. This team would be headed by programmer Hiroyasu Machiguchi. When deciding on the type of game they wanted to make, the team would debate a bit before landing on their final decision, a new shoot-em-up title. Not just any shoot-em-up title though, one that could compete with Namco's now incredibly popular Xevious arcade game. The project would start as a true sequel to Scramble and would be referred to as Scramble 2 throughout most of its production. Coincidentally, Xevious had been created in response to Scramble's resounding success, which made this start to feel like a big ping-pong match between Namco and Konami to see who could make the better arcade shoot-em-up game. This new team would take many of the mechanics Scramble had introduced and build on them in new and interesting ways. The initial graphical concepts for the project would start out much different from Scramble, however, as everything would have very organic designs and be based on biological creatures and anatomy. While many of these designs would be scrapped for a more traditional mechanical style found in popular sci-fi movies at the time, the team would still retain some of these ideas in the final version of the game and revisit others later down the road. One of the biggest goals the development staff had with the creation of this new project was to give it a sense of Seikaiken. Seikaiken, when translated from Japanese, literally means world view, but it is used by artists and designers to refer to the creation of story, lore, and world building that exists beyond what you experience directly in a piece of media. The developers wanted this new arcade title to have more graphical depth and for its world to feel more alive and interesting than its competitors. With computer technology progressing fast and arcade boards growing in power, it had become much more feasible for the team to make their vision a reality and create beautiful environments and complex stages that had never been seen in arcade shoot-em-up games before. The project's artists would utilize unusual designs like the Moai statues from Easter Island, large space volcanoes, and unsettling tentacle creatures to give their new game's world a sense of mystery, awe, and wonder. The other goal the team wanted to implement was a form of player choice in its gameplay. This new game shared very similar mechanics to Scramble, like horizontal 2D scrolling, intense shooting, and missile use for enemies beneath you, But they weren't satisfied with doing just the bare minimum. They initially tried to use a more standard power-up system found in many other games at the time, where the player would simply collect the items they wanted to increase their speed and gain additional weapon types, but it just wasn't very satisfying and fun. The team then tried a brand new concept, a power-up menu where players could customize their speed, weapons, and defense as they played, but in whichever order they preferred. This new system would require the player to collect only one type of power-up currency, represented by orange capsule-like items that would move the highlighted upgrade on the menu bar up one space for each capsule collected. The player's ship started off slow and relatively powerless, but it could be slowly upgraded into a force to be reckoned with. Each space had a different power-up that could be selected, including a speed boost, missiles, a double shot, a laser, a shield that absorbed damage, and an orange option. These option bubbles, sometimes referred to as multiples, would follow the path of the player's ship and mimicked each shot it took, effectively doubling its firepower up to 4 times. The shield text on the upgrade bar was oddly represented by a question mark instead of the word shield. This was because there had been plans to originally add more abilities available on that slot, but the team was strapped for time and only the shield made it to the game's final version. Each upgrade selection would require collecting a certain amount of power-up capsules. An increase in your speed only cost 1 capsule, while something more substantial like an option would cost 5. This would allow each player to create their own custom upgrade experience and try out different combinations of powering up their ship. As this new project slowly started to become its own entity and move away from simply being a sequel to Scramble, they would need a new name for it. While many of this new project's concepts and gameplay took a lot of time to design and test, its title came about much more quickly. There were already a few different ideas on the table, but a co-worker of one of the game's designers had suggested the title Gradius. It was easy to say and simple enough to remember. The name was perfect. It is often speculated that Gradius is just a mistranslation or mispronunciation of gladius, the Latin word for sword, but this has since been debunked by the original developers themselves. The title actually refers to the planet the player must protect from the game's invading antagonist, the massive Bacterian Empire. The final piece of the puzzle would be designing the player's ship itself. Early designs had it resembling a seahorse before it took on the appearance of a more traditional-looking fighter ship. The front part of the fuselage resembled a large, 2-pronged fork and gave the ship its interesting and unique look. They would name this ship the Vic Viper. Inspired by the 2 prolonged sections having a V shape, the designers would decide on Vic for the first half of the ship's name. The second half, Viper, would be named after the snake-like movement of the orange options moving behind the ship during gameplay. Later on, one of the Vic Viper's designers admitted to basing the ship's look off a spaceship from a popular sci-fi movie. While he never specified the film, many people have assumed it was Battlestar Galactica's Colonial Viper Mark VII, which lends extra credence due to the Viper part in the Vic Viper's name. While many arcade shoot-'em-ups only used a 2-button system, Gradius's arcade cabinet would be one of the first to implement 3 buttons. 1 to fire your main weapon, 1 to fire missiles, and 1 to select your choice of upgrade from the power-up bar. The final version of the game consisted of 7 different stages that ranged from a floating island of attacking Moai heads to a highly advanced interstellar base. A recurring boss called the Big Core Mark I would appear at the end of the first 5 levels, blocking the player's path until it was defeated. The 6th stage had a unique boss called the Nucleus, while the 7th's final boss was a large brain that wouldn't fight back as you slowly destroyed it. After completing the last stage, the game would continuously loop, allowing players to remain endlessly going through it even on just 1 credit. Defenseless and easy final bosses, as well as the game looping mechanic, would become commonplace features found in future titles of the series. When the game finally released in Japanese arcades in 1985, it was received incredibly well and would be considered a huge success. Players loved the beautiful graphics, the variety in level designs, the addicting gameplay, and especially the unique power-up system. It became clear very quickly that Konami and their new development team had a big hit on their hands. Gradius would receive countless ports to many platforms over the following decades, including the Famicom, NES, PC Engine, PlayStation, Nintendo Wii, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, and various PC versions. Both the PC Engine and MSX ports actually included an exclusive stage not found in the arcade game called Wasteland. When Gradius finally launched overseas, it would be released under a different name entirely in both arcades and on the MSX as Nemesis. Strangely, the MSX version in Japan would also use the name Nemesis, and the North American NES version would retain the original Gradius title. After Gradius' successful arcade debut, its team began on a new chapter in the series, though it would not share the same title as its predecessor.